Hello, today we're going to be learning a bit about fossils and how fossils form, or fossilization. So you probably already know the fossil is the remains, the left behind, or the evidence of something that was once alive. Fossils have to be at least 10,000 years old and not human-made. So an ancient hammer from early civilizations would not count as a fossil. Fossils provide evidence for how life and the surface of Earth has changed over the 4.5 billion year history of Earth. Most fossils are going to be found in sedimentary rocks, very rarely in igneous or metamorphic rocks. Can you think why? It all comes down to how these rocks are formed. Sedimentary rocks are formed in layers that compress over time, and so something could easily get stuck in between layers. Igneous rocks form from magma or lava cooling and hardening. Magma deep in the hottest places of Earth, you're not really going to have any life there to begin with. And lava that might be flowing down the side of a volcano isn't going to preserve any parts of the organism. Metamorphic rocks form when igneous or sedimentary rocks go through immense heat and pressure. So this extremely high heat and pressure is likely going to destroy any fossils that you already had in the sedimentary rock when they change. So you very rarely find fossils in metamorphic rocks. It's also important to know that only the hard parts of plants and animals become fossils. Bones, teeth, those are the kinds of things that are most likely to be preserved. Soft bits like flesh, feathers, muscles, all of that is likely to decay. So lava is going to just eat through any of that before it can become fossilized. And the people who study fossils and try to piece together the history of life on Earth are paleontologists. So most organisms do not get preserved. Making a fossil is actually pretty rare and doesn't happen as often as you might think. Organisms have to be buried quickly by sedimentation, so those rock layers, and they have to have hard parts that will last, so like bones, teeth, things like that, that will stay behind and won't decay quickly. You also need some kind of protection from the elements. Water causes a lot of weathering and erosion. So if you have a fossil that is exposed to the elements, to rain and wind and flowing water, it's likely that that's going to be swept up or eroded away. So you need hard parts, rapid burial, and something to protect you from the elements, from the stuff going on. So perhaps here this is a fish that has died in the ocean. The water is carrying small rocks and particles into the sea, into the lake, and so the fish gets buried by layers of sediment, and the fossil is left behind under all those layers of sediment. There are six main types of fossils that you need to be familiar with. The first is a mold, a cast, an imprint or a carbon film. Then we've got petrification, an entire organism being preserved, and a trace fossil. So let's go through those in detail. A mold is a fossil that forms when the soft parts decay, the hard parts get dissolved, like through chemical means, and you're left with a gap in the rock. You can think of a mold as a cake pan in the shape of whatever organism there was. So the rock forms around this organism, all of the soft parts decay. Then water or something is seeping into the rock, and it eats away at the hard parts, at the bone or the shell or whatever was left behind, until eventually you have just an empty space in the shape of your original organism. On the other hand, a cast is when that mold gets filled in by minerals or by rocks. So a mold is a cake pan, then water carrying minerals seeps into the mold, the minerals harden, and you get something, an entirely new rock in the shape of what was once there. So a mold is a cake pan and a cast is the cake. Then there's an imprint. This is like an impression, a footprint left in mud that hardens, a plant left in mud, and then the mud hardens, and you're left with an imprint of the plant. There's also a carbon film, which is another flat fossil. When there's so much pressure from all of these sedimentary rock layers on top of each other, you can squeeze out all of the liquids and gases of an organism and leave behind just a thin film of carbon. This is a process called carbonization and leaves behind this carbon film. Next, there's petrification, which you probably have heard of before, like a petrified tree. Sometimes fossils get turned to stone. This is different from a mold filling with minerals to become a cast. Here we have minerals slowly seeping into an organism and turning it to stone or to rock from the inside out. So here, like a petrified tree, this is something that has been turned to stone from the inside out. There is a similar process called permineralization. This leaves behind a combination of minerals and organic remains. So if it's been entirely replaced by minerals or by rocks, it is petrified. If it is some kind of mix of minerals and organic remains, it hasn't entirely been turned to rock, it is permineralized. Next, it is very rare, but you can preserve an entire organism. You can do this with little or no change from death in three main ways. The first is by freezing. If an organism gets frozen rapidly, it can change very little from the moment it died. We are right now finding a lot of these fossils in Siberia as the permafrost is melting, and we're finding lots of like mammoth cubs. Some mammoths have been found with food undigested in their stomach still. They had lunch and then were frozen, and the lunch never digested. So you can have an organism entirely preserved by freezing. By preserving in amber, if you've seen Jurassic Park, this is where everything gets kicked off. Amber is essentially hardened tree sap. So this insect here might have been hanging out on the side of a tree and some sap came down and surrounded it. The insect died and then the sap hardened very quickly. So it gets trapped inside this sticky mess and then the sap hardens and you are stuck in amber. And this only happens with certain trees. The last way you can entirely preserve an organism is in a tar pit. Tar is this hot, sticky, black goo, and if an animal were to fall in a tar pit, it would be pretty much entirely preserved from the moment it died. Lastly, you should be familiar with trace fossils. These aren't actual pieces of the organism, but they are evidence that the organism was once there. They can tell you about the size, the behavior, did they travel in a pack, how many legs did they have, etc. It is not a copy of the organism, like the imprint was a copy of that leaf in mud, but just evidence that it was once there. So this could be everything from footprints, burrows, which are, like animal burrows, an anthill, tubes in the ground that have been filled with minerals now. Coprolites, which are fossilized poop or fossilized stomach content, and gastroliths. Birds and certain reptiles don't have teeth to chew their food, so they will swallow rocks, and the rocks will bounce around in the bird's stomach to grind up the food for them. And so we can find these stomach stones that were used for grinding up food, these gastroliths, and that can tell us about the diet and about the organism. Fossils can tell us a couple of different things besides just about an individual organism. It can tell us what life forms have existed at different times through Earth's history. It can tell us changes that have occurred in particular organisms over time. We can see how organisms have evolved throughout time to best suit their environment. We can see changes that have occurred within the Earth. We have found coal in Antarctica, which shows that at some point there was a warm swamp in Antarctica because that's how coal forms. We've also found corals in the Midwest United States, which tells us there used to be a shallow, warm sea in what is currently the Midwest US. And this can also tell us about changes in past weather and climate conditions. Same as with knowing that coal in Antarctica proves it was once warm and tropical there. We can also use fossils in kind of the same way we did stratigraphy before, this idea of fossil succession, that fossils are going to go in an order, and the oldest fossils are going to be on the bottom, and the youngest fossils will be on top. So we already kind of did this a little bit when we did some rock correlation, but you can use fossils the same way to correlate rock layers and put things in order from oldest to youngest. Then if you combine that with radioactive dating or half-life dating, I can figure out exactly how old a fossil is and get an idea of how old all of the rock layers around it are. Then there are special fossils that we can see are particularly useful for this correlation in different areas. So we call these index fossils. Index fossils have three traits. One, they are very distinct or easy to recognize. Two, they are abundant. They have to be in a lot of different places. And three, they have to have lived for a relatively short period of time. So if you've got a fossil that is spread out, it is found everywhere in the world, and it was only around for a particular chunk of time, that is going to be a pretty good index fossil. We have now found index fossils for all sorts of different time periods. So you can see here, going back even to the Cambrian period and that first explosion of life, we've got at least two different index fossils. And then for each period we have defined in Earth's history. One of the best examples of an index fossil is something called an ammonite. Ammonites are sea creatures that lived in the late Triassic to late Cretaceous period, so while the dinosaurs were around. There are different species of ammonites that lived at more specific times. Certain only lived in the late Jurassic. But if you find an ammonite fossil in a rock layer, you can assume that during the Triassic to Cretaceous periods, there was an ocean in this spot. There are ammonites that look different, and so they probably lived at not exactly the same time or at slightly different times. So what differences do you notice between these two different ammonite species? That's going to be it for this introduction to fossils and fossilization. Check out the activity that we've got next to see how we can use half-life dating, relative dating or stratigraphy, and fossils all together to get a clear history of all of these layers of Earth and what that tells us about Earth's history.